Hi, I'm Ashley Ford, and this is 112BK. Coming up, Ritchie Torres, chair of the City Council's Committee on Oversight and Investigations, brings us up to date on lead, liability, and the latest NYCHA news.
The failure of lead safety in public housing has been decades in the making.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not only a failure that belongs to the de Blasio administration or the Bloomberg administration, but also mayors before them.
And then, trial by deal. How 95% of people convicted in America get there via plea bargains with prosecutors. The Innocence Project says the system is in desperate need of reform.
Our clients, on average, serve 14 years behind bars before they were released. And we have clients that serve 20, 30, up to 40 years behind bars for crimes they didn't commit. The unique horror of wrongful conviction can't really be put into words. It really can only be understood by the people that have experienced it. But what they share is, you know, they were robbed of everything.
Coming up, Americans are being convicted of crimes without one juror being impaneled, one piece of evidence being admitted, or one witness being called. The Innocence Project is calling for change. But first, a shocking new report from the New York Times has found that for at least 2 decades, the New York City Housing Authority consistently dodged and disputed tests that revealed lead in its apartments. Based on thousands of pages of documents and 100 interviews, the new report says that between 2010 and 2018, NYCHA challenged 95% of the lead orders it received from the city's Department of Health. More than 1,100 children have tested positive for lead in New York City's public housing since 2012. This comes as New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announced plans to bring repairs to 62,000 NYCHA apartments. To tell us more, we're joined on the phone by Ritchie Torres, council member from District 15. He's also the chairman of the city's Committee on Oversight and Investigations. Councilmember Torres, welcome back to 112BK.
It's an honor to be here.
You've been very active in the fight against lead poisoning and holding perpetrators accountable, which is very, very important work. But can you please tell us what the takeaway was from this report specifically?
So we knew, we've known for about a year as a result of the DOI report that from 2012 to 2016, not only was NYCHA failing to conduct legally required lead safety inspections, but NYCHA had been submitting false testimony, false certifications to the federal government. But in light of the New York Times report, we've come to discover that even before 2012, there's no evidence that NYCHA ever had a successful or effective lead safety program. That for decades, NYCHA has been in denial about the true scale of lead poisoning and lead paint in public housing. And NYCHA's been complacent about lead inspections, lead testing, lead abatement, and has been particularly aggressive when it comes to challenging lead abatement orders from the Department of Health. So the article indicates that private landlords challenge lead abatement orders 4% of the time, whereas NYCHA challenges it 95% of the time.
That's a big number.
So NYCHA literally put far more energy and resources into challenging lead testing results than actually solving the problem.
Oh my gosh. And I know that one of your main concerns has been matching the city's definition of lead poisoning with the federal government's. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yes, so historically the city has defined lead poisoning at either a blood level of 10 micrograms per deciliter or 15, whereas the federal government recommends a threshold at level 5.
Right.
So there was a whole universe of children who had what the federal government would consider hazardously high levels of lead, but for whom there was no public health intervention from the city at all.
Right.
And once you are exposed to lead, it has consequences that haunt you for the rest of your life. It can cripple your ability to succeed academically in school and to succeed personally in life.
Right. Can you talk? Mayor de Blasio has announced a new plan for NYCHA, right? Could you tell us what that plan is, what it means?
Yeah. So the de Blasio administration came out with Next Generation NYCHA 2, which I see as an improvement on Next Generation NYCHA 1, and at the heart of Next Gen 2 is a program known as the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, otherwise known as RAD. And under RAD, traditional public housing is converted into Section 8 so that NYCHA can access new sources of funding. So even though it sounds like a complicated program, it's simple. It means that the tenants can live in the same apartment. The tenants pay the same rent. You pay no more than 30% of your income toward your rent.
Right.
The only difference is that there's more money for repairs. There's more money for long overdue repairs. So I'll provide you with an example. The first example of a RAD conversion was a public housing development in Far Rockaway, Queens, known as Ocean Bay. Before RAD, Ocean Bay had been starved of funding for decades, for 60 years. After RAD, Ocean Bay received $560 million in renovations. So for the first time, you had a resident living in apartments free of mold and mildew, free of lead and leaks, with reliable heat and hot water. You had buildings with new bricks and new roofs, new elevators, and new boilers. You had tenants who historically had been treated as second-class citizens living in first-class affordable housing. And so RAD is the only program that I know of that can transform the living conditions of public housing residents.
Right.
It's a controversial program, but I think the controversy is based more on misunderstanding.
Yeah, that makes sense. The New York Times article also mentioned a 5-year-old Brooklynite, Michaela Bonaparte, and that her blood showed lead at levels almost never seen in modern New York. That's according to the Times. That's what they said. My question is, who should we hold accountable for Michaela's condition? I know who I would like to hold accountable, but who do we hold accountable for her and for other children like her?
The failure of lead safety in public housing has been decades in the making.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not only a failure that belongs to the de Blasio administration or the Bloomberg administration, but also mayors before them.
Right.
But I will tell you, there were a number of executives who knowingly submitted false information to the federal government, who knew that NYCHA was out of compliance with local and federal law on lead safety, who knew that NYCHA's practices were endangering the welfare and safety of children. Those executives should be criminally prosecuted.
Yeah. I don't think anybody...
Ongoing criminal investigation, and I'm hoping that investigation results in real accountability.
I hope so, too. I don't think you're alone in that. Thank you so much for talking with us today, Ritchie Torres.
Of course. Take care.
So 95% of felony convictions in the U.S. come from guilty pleas. That's right. Prosecutors don't really like taking cases to trial, so they apply a lot of pressure to make a deal. They may offer less time, lesser charges, or smaller fines. Add to that the likelihood your lawyer, despite all good intentions, has a heavy caseload and can't devote sufficient attention to your case. And even if someone doesn't take a plea from the prosecutor, they'll get pressure from the judge. Say you'll be in court during the third adjournment, and he or she will say, "Son," because it's usually a son, "don't you just want to take the plea? You're facing a lot more time if you don't." So what happens? People take the plea, even if they're innocent. Hard to believe, but not really if you've seen how things actually work. Our next guest has seen how things work, and she's going to tell us about that and what's being done to fix it. She's the director of policy at the Innocence Project, a decades-old legal organization committed to exonerating wrongfully convicted individuals. Oh, and by the way, of those people who've been exonerated, 18% had pleaded guilty. Rebecca Brown, welcome to 112BK.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Can you tell me more about the Innocence Project's Guilty Plea Problems campaign?
Absolutely. So the Innocence Project has proven the innocence of more than 350 people now nationwide. And this is not just our organization, but a network of innocence organizations that work post-conviction to prove people's innocence.
Right.
And we know from those cases that 11% of those DNA-based exonerations people pled guilty to those crimes. And these are very serious violent crimes like rape and murder. So when you think about the whole criminal justice system, the fact that we have 2.3 million people behind bars in this country, especially people that are behind bars for lower level crimes like misdemeanors, when the stakes are lower, the pressure is even, greater to plead guilty because the stakes are lower, the prison time isn't as long that you're facing, and of course the consequences of going to trial can be profound. So it's a huge problem.
Why are you guys launching this campaign now?
Well, we think a huge part of our work, and our success in the advocacy realm is really educating the public. I think a lot of people don't understand the guilty plea problem. I think they don't understand the extent of it. And I think, the fact that our system is so large, that is why we have a guilty plea problem that is this large, right? Just 20 years ago, 70% of people were choosing to plead guilty. Now it's up to 95%. And that's, and in many ways, that's simply because we have a volume-based system. We are in the era of mass incarceration. We have a system that simply couldn't handle that number of trials. And so the pressure is that much greater for people to plead guilty and, unfortunately and tragically, to crimes they didn't commit.
Why do so many people end up pleading guilty to crimes they don't commit? One of the things that I hear a lot, and I have some idea why this might be the case, but one of the things that I hear a lot is, if it was me, I would never, ever, ever plead guilty. My innocence would be the most important thing. But I think there are certain aspects of being arrested, being in jail, that people don't really understand when it comes to these things.
Right, that's right. I mean, I think there's extraordinary pressure to plead guilty, even though for many it's a counterintuitive phenomenon, right? Like, why would someone plead guilty to a crime they didn't commit? Also, why would people falsely confess to crimes they didn't commit? We know that 28% of our cases involve people who somehow inculpated themselves or, falsely confessed to crimes they didn't commit. So why do people do that? I mean, there are so many reasons. There's fear of a harsher punishment, right? We talked a little before, you mentioned in your introduction sort of the trial penalty, right? That if you don't take the plea, you're facing that much more time. And a lot of people are coming from communities that just don't have, any trust in the system anymore. Right? They don't believe that the system is going to, get to the truth. And if they're facing, 2 years if they plead out versus 10 years if they go to trial, it's actually a rational choice to plead guilty.
But what is the incentive behind having a system that relies so heavily on plea bargains? Because that's really, I guess, what gets me. These people who find themselves caught in the system quite often find themselves caught in the system. But the people who create and perpetuate it, what could they possibly be getting out of it?
Right. Well, I think, unfortunately, the plea system in many ways is a byproduct of mass incarceration. Right? It's one of the sort of collateral consequences, if you will, of having a system that is this large. Right? So if you build it, they will come. You have a larger system. There is no way all of those cases can be dealt with at trial. So I don't know that, system players are necessarily waking up in the morning and saying, how do I elicit pleas from innocent people? But I do think when you build a system that is incentivized to push people through the system through a plea process, that is a tragic byproduct.
Absolutely. And one of the byproducts, I guess, of this system is the cash bail system, which unfortunately does not serve the populations adequately. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think in many ways it's like a tale of two cities, right? If you can afford cash bail, you can fight your case not being in detention. If you can't afford cash bail, you will be detained. And, and of course, the pressure to plea is that much greater. You want to get out of detention, whatever it takes. I mean, there's extreme abuse in prison. I don't have to tell anyone about what prison conditions are like. But it's, the pressures are enormous. So, we shouldn't have a system based on wealth. We should have a system based on justice. And of course, one thing that's missing from many of these, sort of systems is an analysis of someone's ability to pay and setting bail based on someone's ability to pay. New York State has a pretty decent bail law. It offers 9 different possibilities that judges can offer, requiring that they only offer 2. The tragedy is that they often are only offering either bail or detention. But there are all sorts of other options, like unsecured bonds, right? There are other things that judges can be offering that would reduce that pressure, to plead out.
Then why don't we see that as much?
I think that, a lot of this is cultural. And I think, I'm a policy person, right? I work a lot in the state legislatures, but I always say I'm only as effective as culture change. I can pass a law, but if we're not shifting sort of perceptions and sort of how different system players approach the defendants standing in front of them and really see the whole person, we're not going to make the progress that we all want to see.
How would we even begin? Because that's a thing that I find really interesting, and I find that with a lot of these big issues like mass incarceration, part of the problem is we need a culture shift.
Right.
But how do we even begin to start having the conversations that actually change the minds that help push us into that culture shift?
I think that's a great question, and I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think a lot of it is, demonstrating that actually different ways work. It actually doesn't make anyone, if somebody's really just worried about public safety and that's the main driver for them in a policy conversation, it's important to demonstrate to them that actually incarcerating people doesn't make anyone safer. Putting people behind bars for long periods of time, doesn't prepare them to re-enter society, in a way that's going to, be workable, right? And so I think a lot of, our ability to shift culture is to actually show that these alternatives work. And actually, if we think about different and new ways of doing things and approaching people holistically and trying to understand actually what were the things that led to criminal behavior, if in fact there was criminal behavior, was there a lack of social supports? Is there inadequate education? Is there inadequate health care? Is there, is the housing situation just not secure, right? There are many, defender organizations in New York, from the Bronx Defenders, to Neighborhood Defender Services that are really, doing wonderful work in terms of approaching a client holistically, understanding, what are the things that are, holding this person back, and what are the ways that we can kind of make for a healthier society? Because criminal justice, it's a public health issue.
Yes, absolutely. And what options do people have pre-trial? Because I think quite often people don't even know what they can do to advocate for themselves.
Right. I mean, I think, it's very complicated because in many ways, there are many systems that exist that are sort of beyond their control. I mean, I think actually one of the biggest problems facing New York State right now is something called discovery, basically the obligation of the state to provide evidence or information to the defense before trial. In New York State, we are fourth to the bottom in the country, right? In terms of the information that has to be handed over to the defense pre-trial. We don't get witness names, witness statements, or police reports until the eve of trial. So a lot of people refer to this as trial by ambush. And as a result, right, defenders' hands are tied. They don't even know the evidence that is going to be presented against their client, and they certainly can't do any sort of realistic investigation, right? They can't actually adequately defend their clients because they're information starved. So I actually think it is true that people, of course, should always be advocating for themselves, but I think in many ways the system doesn't allow it because the people that nobody's in a position to defend themselves adequately if they don't have the information at the ready. They can't go and interview witnesses. They can't. They don't even know what the evidence is.
Right. And it seems to me that at this point, it would be really hard to get an assessment of how many innocent people there actually are behind bars. But is there any, how do you guys find your clients? How do you figure out who these people are and how to help them? Right.
I mean, obviously, there's such a great need, and the need is so much greater than, what anyone is able to provide. But, we get hundreds of letters a month. People write to the Innocence Project directly. They write to our, innocence organizations around the country, and they're just seeking help post-conviction. So that's really how they're identified. They, write to people themselves. And, in terms of your other question, which was a great one, there are different estimates about how many folks are innocent behind bars. Some estimates as low as 1% to 2%, some as high as 8% to 10%. But when you think about a system with 2.3 million people behind bars, those are huge numbers.
Right. And on top of on top of some of the things you mentioned, what are some of the things that keep defense lawyers from being able to adequately defend their client? Because this is a thing that you hear about quite often, is that they just don't have what they need.
That's exactly right. I mean, we have a profoundly under-resourced defender system in America. And this is not just a New York problem. This is a problem throughout the country.
Right.
New Orleans, the New Orleans public defender a couple of years ago said, we are not going to take more cases. We can't responsibly do it. We can't adequately defend our clients. So we're talking about under-resourced, defender offices. When you think about the fact that, like, the police department really is working on investigating crime in service of a prosecution, there aren't those number of investigators at the defense level. You often have two defenders working in a massive office trying to defend hundreds and hundreds of people. They can't possibly get to them.
Right.
And then also the problem I just talked to you about with discovery, right? If the defense is information starved, if they don't have the information they need to adequately defend their clients, investigate the crime, they can't launch a very strong defense. So people often say, oh, well, my defender pressured me into pleading guilty. It's really, in many ways, the defender's hands are tied because they just don't have the information.
Has the role of the prosecutor changed?
Well, I think, the role, there certainly yes. I think, first of all, we see there are a lot more prosecutors than there ever were. So, it was when crime really spiked in the 80s, we went from having 17,000 prosecutors to 20,000. But then when crime precipitously declined in the next decade, they hired another 10,000 prosecutors. And what we saw, and it mainly correlates to this time period, is that the number of arrests that were charged as felonies went from 1 to 3 to 2 to 3. So, in fact, you were just seeing many more arrests being charged as felonies. So, in essence, the system has just gotten larger and larger. And, this isn't to suggest that prosecutors aren't trying to conduct themselves conscientiously. I think many are. I just think that, we have a system now that, you talked before about incentives. If you have more people working in a system, obviously the expectation is that you are going to criminalize more crimes.
Yes, absolutely. Whew. Can you talk to me about really quickly, just some of the long-term damage of the wrongfully convicted? Because I think not enough people really understand how it affects a life.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. So our clients on average serve 14 years behind bars before they were released. And we have clients that serve 20, 30, up to 40 years behind bars for crimes they didn't commit. The unique horror of wrongful conviction can't really be put into words. It really can only be understood by the people that have experienced it. But what they share is, they were robbed of everything, right? Many of them lost their parents while they were behind bars. Parents died. They lost loved ones. They were robbed of the opportunity to develop their own families and fall in love and have families of their own. They were certainly robbed of the opportunity to professionally develop. We have clients that come out of prison that have never held a cell phone before. They don't know how to use a computer. They certainly can't compete in the workforce. So, everything is basically taken from them. Everything. And to start all over, I mean, our clients are my biggest heroes because many of them do start over. I mean, we have a client who's now a fire chief. We have another client. We have clients who are lawyers now. And they're beyond inspirational. But, I mean, if it were me, I'd be like, in a fetal position in the corner somewhere. So.
Yep, I know what you mean. There are going to be, I'm certain, people who watch this and think, I want to help them. I want to be useful in some way. What can they do? Well,
the first thing they can do is go to our website, www.innocenceproject.org. /pledge. And there you can sign up to get action alerts about things that are happening here in New York State. So as we launch campaigns, and we intend to work very hard on discovery reform this year, people will get alerts, call your lawmaker, support this campaign, host a house party to a teach-in, show a film about, innocence. We have a library of films that we could share with folks. We have a YouTube channel. And just, learn about it. Learn about the crisis of wrongful conviction.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. This is important work, and I'm glad you're doing it.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
And that's our show for today. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. It's my last show. It has been an honor to sit in this seat and talk with you as many days as we've had. And I look forward to a future where hopefully I'll get to talk to you again, if they have me back. Thank you.